My name is John Hill, and I have the privilege of introducing this speaker with the webinar series, Mr. Scott Kirk. Scott's a master's degree of science in environmental health from East Tennessee State University and a Bachelor of Science degree in geology and physics from Appalachian State University. He's also a certified health physicist. Scott currently manages the environmental compliance and waste characterization group of Savannah River remediation. He spent much of his career in the area of regulatory compliance and has been a driving force in the development of sound and sensible regulation focused on radioactive waste management. It is really Scott's vision related to radioactive waste that stands out among his peers. This vision is confirmed by his successful licensing of the United States' first new regional disposal facility in Andrews County, Texas. The creation of options for complex waste streams, such as depleted uranium and greater than Class B low-level waste, and many other innovative contributions to the United States management of radioactive waste. He is a recipient of the 2005 National Service Award from the Health Physics Society, the 2017 Richard S. Hodes, MD Honor Lecture Award from the Southeast Compact Commission for Low-Level Radioactive Waste Management, and the 2019 inaugural Nuclear Service Award in recognition of his lifetime achievements in the nuclear industry by the Citizens for Nuclear Technology Awareness. His lecture today is titled Mentors and Supporting a Scientific Professional Organization, A Story of Radium-226, NARM, and the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Scott, congratulations and welcome.
Thank you, John. As John had mentioned, I'm going to give a presentation today. It'll be talking largely about mentors and the value of joining a scientific professional organization. And I'll also capture a very important story, I think, at least from the Health Physics Society standpoint, and it's a story about radium-226, naturally occurring and accelerator-produced radioactive materials, and the Energy Policy Act of 2005. You know, I ask each of the speakers at the end of their presentations throughout this internship lecture series, what is the single most important piece of advice that we would share with young professionals to help ensure that they have a rewarding and successful career? And I decided to start this presentation with that question. And what I would encourage you to do is to join a scientific professional organization. You can be mentored by recognized experts. You can also start to build very professional relationships that might guide your career into the future. You might be given opportunities to write peer-reviewed professional papers for publication. At least in my case, I specialize in health physics, but also regulatory affairs and licensing. And a lot of my work has been focused on contributing and trying to influence policies and rulemakings. One of the most important mentors that I ever met was Neil J. Newman. Neil was the General Counsel for Nuclear Fuel Services. I worked with Neil for 10 years. Neil is no longer with us anymore, but I still remember his words of advice. Those include nurturing relationships to build trust and inspire confidence. Technical competence is paramount. Build strong, diverse teams. Seek and hire the experts. He often said, too, that timing is often everything, and I think my story will capture that point. He also said that we should, and this was really directed towards me, is to strive to make the complex simple. A lot of the work that we do is highly complicated, but to be able to condense it down to its essentials, it can be a real challenge, but it's also very important, especially when you're communicating to a wide variety of audiences. One of the other things that Neil used to say a lot was work for good and just causes. A couple of the projects I worked with Neil on is that at Nuclear Fuel Services, we made fuel to power every submarine and aircraft carrier in the United States Navy's fleet. One of the other important projects that we did is, it was a nuclear nonproliferation project where we downblended highly enriched uranium to be used for fuel to generate electricity for the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's also important to note that a lot of that work was also done here at the Savannah River site. The Savannah River site handled the irradiated portions of the HEU, whereas at Nuclear Fuel Services, we handled the portion that was lesser irradiated. Other two important mentors that I had was when I was working at Battelle, and this is in Columbus, Ohio, was Mr. Steve Landecker and Gene Rowe. They were senior managements at Battelle in Columbus. They encouraged me to become a certified health physicist. They also encouraged me to join the Health Physics Society and contribute by professionally and by serving others. They also encouraged me to contact Dr. Otto Rabi, who was then the president of the Health Physics Society, for appointment into the Health Physics Society's Legislation and Regulations Committee. I had told Steve that's what I wanted to do. I thought it would be really helpful for me to do so, but I also asked him how could I get an appointment. And this is what he told me. He told me I needed to contact Otto Rabi. I'm going to go to the next slides. I'll tell you a little bit about Otto. Now, Otto was the president of the Health Physics Society, but he's also an internationally renowned internal dosimetrist. He studied the health effects for intakes of radium-226 that we'll get into. But also, he worked at the University of California in Davis. And so I was expected to call this gentleman. He'd never met me before. And I did. I had a lot of trepidations by calling someone who's the president of the Health Physics Society, especially being a young member, but asking how I could be appointed to be serving on this committee. Otto recognized my trepidations, but he also recognized and acknowledged that he wanted to help me as a new member of the society, and he agreed to help me to the appointment. And he did so by contacting then the chairperson, which was Jim Tripides, who chaired the Legislation and Regulations Committee, and asked him to appoint me to serve on it, which Jim did. So the committee itself, we worked with members from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, state regulatory agencies, and national laboratories, as well as a trade organization, which is the Nuclear Energy Institute. At that time, I started to meet some very profound professional individuals that would shape my career. I was later appointed to chair the committee, and I served on that committee as chair until 2009. One of the really cool things that we did as part of the committee, we prepared comments for rulemakings, federal guidance, and even testimony for congressional hearings. Another person who was instrumental in my career as a mentor was Mr. Keith Dinger. Keith was a past president of the Health Physics Society. He also served as the Health Physics Society's federal and congressional and federal agency liaison. And he had retired from the United States Navy, and he was a certified health physicist. It was really his role in serving as the congressional and federal agency liaison that he really helped shape my career. One of the things he did early on in 2004 was he requested me to prepare a written testimony for a Senate hearing. The Government Accountability Office had issued a report, in large part because the disposal facility in Barnwell, South Carolina, was scheduled to restrict access to their disposal facility in Barnwell. And that was really driven by legislation that was passed by South Carolina in 2001. And what it meant was, as of July 1st, 2008, waste that was Class B and C low-level waste would be effectively stranded unless you belonged to the Atlantic Compact, which was South Carolina, Connecticut, and New Jersey. So I prepared that legislation. I had 2 weeks I prepared that testimony. I had 2 weeks to get it accomplished, but I had a tremendous group standing behind me. I had senior members from the Health Physics Society, from my committees. We all worked together, and we prepared that testimony. Just as a sort of a primer, last year Larry Camper gave a really good tutorial on Part 61 and low-level waste, but in order to frame this presentation, I probably need to share a few things with you. Now, one of the things that Congress did in 1980 and then subsequently amended in 1985 was to amend the Low-Level Waste Policy Act. And what it did is it forced commercial or states to either form their own waste disposal facilities or they could join compacts, and then that compact could develop their own waste disposal facilities. I mean, what that means, though, is that a waste compact, they can allow the import or not allow the import or export of low-level radioactive waste into or out of their compact. There's currently 4 disposal facilities located across the United States, which is in Washington, like I said, in Barnwell, South Carolina, at WCS in Texas, and in Utah. To make things a little bit more complicated, and the presentation will hit on this in a little bit, now low-level waste is not what it is, but it's defined by what it's not. What it's not is high-level waste, spent fuel, true waste, and I have it highlighted because there's a different story you can ask me about later on that. It also includes 11E2, 11E3, and 11E4 byproduct materials. And it's broken down into different waste classes. It's class A, B, C, and greater than class low-level waste. And depending upon what low-level waste is, you need to look at which statute it is. The Low-Level Waste Policy Act amendments of 1985 has a different set of definitions than what's in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. And that really helps distinguish between how low-level waste is regulated in the in the commercial sector or by the Department of Energy. Soon after 9/11, Congress became actively involved on issues related to radiological terrorism. One of the things they were worried about was the creation and the detonation of a radiological dispersal device, commonly known as a dirty bomb. That was a major concern of Congress. Assessments had indicated that some of these RDDs could cause very high doses of radiation to members of the public. There was also concern and recognized that there could be enormous financial and psychological harm that could be caused to our societies. And they really pointed to the aftermath of a radiological accident that had occurred in Brazil. And really what that led to was 4 people had passed away from acute radiation poisoning, but it caused a tremendous amount of concern by the citizens in Brazil as to whether or not they could have been exposed to radioactive materials. And it also incurred a tremendous cost to recover from that event. So the concern was if someone lit off an RDD in this country, it could harm people locally, but it would cause tremendous psychological and social concerns in our country. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, they began to take actions by creating a regulatory framework that would be undertaken by signature countries to protect public health and safety from the malevolent uses of a sealed radiological source. So this is about the Code of Conduct. This is what the International Atomic Energy Agency created. In 2003, George W. Bush agreed at commitments. It was at the G8 summit in Avignon, France, to implement provisions of the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct included radium-226, which is a naturally occurring radioactive materials, but it also included accelerator-produced radionuclides. The key part is that agreement states they're authorized to establish compatible regulations for health and safety measures, but not for the common defense and security of the United States. The NRC has exclusive licensing authority for the purposes of common defense and security. However, the legislative changes by Congress that were really needed were to be all-encompassing. So what I have on the right-hand side of the screen is the different radionuclides that are in the Code of Conduct for Category 1 and Category 2 sources. And you can see radium-226 is dialed in. The point of that being is that the NRC at that time did not have regulatory authority to regulate accelerator-produced or radium-226 or other naturally occurring materials that were included on the Code of Conduct. And so that was a solution that Congress needed to find a solution for. So Keith Dinger, he created an initiative with the Health Physics Society, and initially it was also jointly with the Conference of Radiation Control Program Directors and the Organization of Agreement States. And he put together a very excellent summary, and it provides a lot of the background that I'm going to share over the next few slides with you. It was published in the Health Physics News in January of 2005. And again, what we were charged to do was to prepare a joint position statement and some draft legislation. And it would involve the reclassification of radium-226 and other naturally occurring radioactive materials and accelerator-produced byproduct materials, and we refer to this as NARM. It also will require an amendment to the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 to establish the NRC as the sole regulatory authority that had the direction to regulate these materials in the commercial sector. And it was also recognized that the states, they had authority to regulate sources of naturally occurring and accelerator-produced radioactive materials for decades. They had already had regulations in place for doing so, but that was for the health and safety, not for national security. Just as a little bit of background, right now there's 39 states that have entered into an agreement with the NRC and they're required to establish compatible regulations. Once an agreement state has demonstrated that they have compatible regulations, an agreement state is only an agreement state once the governor of that state and the chairman of the NRC sign an agreement. And that's when a state becomes an agreement state. When that happens, the NRC discontinues its regulatory authority over those programs pursuant to that agreement. However, all the states must comply with regulations that are not an agreement state. They also have to comply solely with the NRC's requirements. And there are limitations to these provisions. For example, the NRC has exclusive licensing authority over commercial nuclear power reactors, research and test reactors, fuel cycle facilities licensed under Part 70, also for licensees that possess critical mass of special nuclear materials as defined in 10 CFR Part 150. And they also have exclusive licensing authority over providing for the common defense and security of the nation for radioactive materials. So back in 2002, as I'd mentioned, Congress was greatly concerned that RDD could be used to make a dirty bomb in this country. Senator Hillary Clinton introduced the Dirty Bomb Prevention Act of 2002, and the HPS leadership around the 2004-05 timeframe began working with a congressional fellow who had worked for her staff. I think he was on loan from the State Department, but he was instrumental in having the IAEA step up their program to develop the Code of Conduct. And I think one of the things I did, Allison, there was a press release from the White House as soon as George W. Bush made the commitments at the G8 summit, and he laid out sort of what the United States had committed to, and I shared that press release with you, and hopefully you'll share that with the rest of the interns here. And so the congressional fellow, he reached out to the Health Physics Society and then later with the organizations of agreement states because he wanted some help with the legislation. And I'll get to it. The legislation they had put together had a few holes in it. But he reached out to the HPS primarily because they were a nonprofit, scientific, professional organization comprised of members with expert knowledge in radiation safety and regulations. And also, very importantly, it lacked any conflict of interest. So the congressional fellow asked us to look at the legislation that was going through Congress to see if there were certain things that we could do to help fix it. The Senate also then began to prepare what was referred to as the Nuclear Security Act of 2003 and then the Dirty Bomb Prevention Act of 2003 as well. And then those two pieces of legislation were forwarded to the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. It was later combined into a bill which was titled the Nuclear Infrastructure Security Act of 2003. In that the Nuclear Infrastructure Security Act of 2003, they added Section 7, and it was titled "In Treatment of Accelerator-Produced and Other Radioactive Materials as Byproduct Material." The staff intended to place controls over radium-226, NORM, and other accelerator-produced radioactive materials that could be concentrated in a significant enough quantity to make a RDD and regulations that would be established by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The staff recognized that legislation was consistent also with the Health Physics Society's position titled Compatibility in Radiation Safety and Regulations. And the point of this being is that what the Health Physics Society and the Organization of Agreement States was really trying to promote was radioactive materials should be regulated based on health and safety, not just on who has authority for it. And so there was a real common need to see if we could get some uniformity and harmonization based on the legislation that we were promoting. And the other important part was in 2004, the U.S. had entered into agreement to impose import-export controls over certain radioactive materials, including radium-226 as part of the Code of Conduct. but since the NRC did not have authority in 2004 to do so, they could not restrict the importation or exportation at that time. So Hillary Clinton then introduced a standalone bill to establish centralized control over radium-226, NARM, and accelerated reproduced radioactive materials. The bill was titled Senate Bill 2763, a bill to amend the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 to clarify the treatment of accelerated produced and other radioactive materials as byproduct materials. It included the exact same language that was in Section 7 of the Infrastructure Security Act of 2003 that had already been referred to the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. And what you see on the right-hand side what you see on the right-hand side is the press release from Senator Clinton's office at the time. I was requested to pull together and convene a working group of experts. And we would be charged with preparing a position statement. We even marked up the Atomic Energy Act as we thought it was needed. I'll get to the memberships of the committee in a second. But it also included a framework for regulating radium-226, NARM, and accelerated produced radioactive materials. And what it also defined are two new types of radioactive materials or byproduct materials that would be called 11E3 and 11E4 byproduct materials. So what you see on the right-hand side of the screen is the markup of the Atomic Energy Act. These are the members of the committee. It was Jim Tripaduce. You heard from Barbara Hamrick. Barbara has helped me several times on initiatives like this. It included Michael Gilley, Ralph Anderson, and April Chance. The leaderships included Dr. Ken Case, Dr. Ray Galmet, David Conley, and I chaired the group. We also got a team of attorneys to also volunteer. And we did this work for free of charge, obviously. We were volunteers. It included the law firm of Tony Thompson, Chris Pugsley, and Charlie Simmons. For the organizations of Agreement State and CRCPD, we had Barbara Hamrick, Ed Bailey, and Stan Fitch, and Jared Thompson helped co-chair the session with me. It also had to be reviewed and approved by the Health Physics Society's Scientific and Public Issues Committee, and that was the current and past four presidents of the Health Physics Society. So the working group recognized that the bill 2763 it would require some changes to avoid creating waste streams with no paths for disposal. The 11E3 and 11E4 byproduct materials were excluded in the definition of low-level waste as we had proposed it. And what we were trying to get at was that 11E3, the radium-226, and the accelerated produced radioactive materials, it would not be defined as low-level waste, and thereby we could find better places and easier places that would have less regulatory restrictions, and we could still promote health and safety. One of the key things that we also did is we decided that the term discrete source of radium-226 that was called out in the legislation, as a group of experts, we could not come up with what that term meant. So as a solution, we said what should happen is it should be defined in a rulemaking. And so what we thought is that the NRC would promulgate a rulemaking, and that term would be defined with wide stakeholder involvement. The legislation that we also looked at would also encourage the NRC to actively engage with agreement states, and it included provisions for an orderly transition of authority that would allow the states to continue with their regulations without disruption until the NRC completed a rulemaking. So what you see on the right-hand side is a letter that I helped pull together. We wrote it over Christmas of 2004, and this went to a wide distribution of members of Congress. And again, this is what helped to introduce the position statement and the draft legislation that we pulled together. So the position statement and draft language that we had submitted to members of Congress on January the 14th of 2005, the position statement was titled, "Congressional Action is Needed to Ensure Uniform Safety and Security Regulations for Certain Radioactive Materials." And this is the distribution. This is the members of Congress I went to. I went to Senator Clinton, Senator Craig, Senator Crapo, Senator Domenici, Senator Craig, Senator Jim Inhofe, Senator Reed, Senator Voinovich, and then it went to three members of Congress, Joe Barton, Ralph Hall, and Heather Wilson. It also went to each of the 3 commissioners of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It went to OSHA. It went to Frank Marcinowski at the Department of Energy. It went to Paul Lohaus. It went to the CRCPD, which is Ed Bailey and Charles Harden. It also went to Mary Clark, and she was with the Environmental Protection Agency. It went to the National Governors Association, and it went to Todd Lovinger for the Low Level Waste Radioactive Waste Forum. Soon thereafter, after we had submitted our legislation, we were reached out to by the NRC. NRC chairman at the time, Niles Diaz, his staff reached out, and he scheduled a teleconference with us so that we could compare or share our thoughts as to why we put into the legislation and the position statements that we did. And so we had a teleconference on March the 23rd of that year. The NRC staff, they acknowledged that the Office of Congressional Affairs was proposing legislative changes as well to authorize its responsibilities to regulate NARM. The NRC also expressed a deep appreciation for the Health Physics Society and the organizations of Agreement State in seeking similar legislation in order to implement the Code of Conduct. And what you see on the right-hand side of the screen is the letter that we received back from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that came from Mr. Paul Lohaus, and he was a director at the time for the state and tribal programs. Soon thereafter, March, in the spring of that year, there was a lot of support for legislation to move this initiative forward. There was a bill from Ed Markey. There was also a joint press release from Senator Anhoff and Voinovich, and then again there was one from Senator Clinton as well. Mr. Ed Helminski, the late Ed Helminski, he used to own the Exchange Monitor publications. You guys probably see that in the Weapons Monitor Exchange. And he had put on a series of presentations on a number of different topics. But he had invited me to give a presentation at the 20th anniversary of the Radioactive Exchange Low-Level Radioactive Waste Decision Makers Forum that was held in Snowbird, Utah. And that was held on July the 28th. At least that's when my presentation was. And I had given this presentation previously at a conference with the National Mining Association with the NRC who was present. They had asked for me to share my presentation with them, and I did. And you can see that same presentation is in the NRC's database called ATOMS. It's part of their public library. Now, in the presentation, we discussed interactions with the NRC staff, and I also shared a comparison between the legislative language that had been proposed by the NRC versus that from the Health Physics Society and in the Organization of Agreement State. I recognized at the time that both of the versions, either from the NRC's bill or the one that we had put forth, would help fill a void in the Atomic Energy Act. And that was because it would allow federal legislation and regulations for radium-226, accelerated produced radioactive materials, and other types of naturally occurring radioactive materials that had not previously been regulated at the federal level. During that conference, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether or not the initiatives that we had put together would actually be implemented into law. I had several discussions with many people about that at the conference at that time. But let me see. But on July the 27th, the day before my presentation, Keith Dinger had called and let me know about major developments that had occurred that day. What he said is that Senator Pete Domenici and Jim Inhofe had agreed to incorporate the source security legislation as part of the Energy Policy Act. And they had done that as part of a conference committee. And what that means is that if there's a bill passed by the House of Representatives, there's a similar bill passed by the Senate, they convene a conference and they pull together and they work out a compromise. And so what had taken place is that the legislation that we had in the Dirty Bomb Prevention Act, the Infrastructure Security Act, those had all been rolled together and the details worked out. But those provisions would then be incorporated into the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And once it passed out of the conference committee, what that meant was it would be going to the Senate for the next week, either for a thumbs up or a thumbs down vote. And the revised bill that was put forth, what it said is that the NRC would have to complete a comprehensive rulemaking within 18 months of the date that legislation was signed into law. So what I did is I went back up into my hotel room and I revised my presentation. And so I put, yesterday, the Nuclear Security Act of 2005 was included in Section 9 of the Energy Policy Act. Again, we were expecting it to be voted either thumbs up or thumbs down, and that there was a press release from Senator Domenici regarding provisions of the energy bill that had been approved by the conference committee. And it was reported at the time that President Bush had reported to sign the legislation if it came on his desk. So the following week, Congress passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005 for approval, and then sent it to approval to President George W. Bush. On August the 8th, 2005, President George W. Bush signed the legislation into law, and the United States became the first of 74 member states to enact legislation to establish the framework by initiating a rulemaking to fulfill its obligations under the Code of Conduct. Soon thereafter, the NRC initiated a rulemaking. It was called the Expanded Definition of Byproduct Materials. And at that time, myself and Jared Thompson, who co-chaired this committee with me, we put together a summary article as to what this initiative took place. And this really followed up with the January 2005 article that Mr. Keith Dinger had pulled together. This has been, I tell you, probably one of the highlights of my whole career. The night before I gave my presentation, Ed Hilminski sat us down at a table for dinner. We were outside in Snowbird, Utah. It was beautiful. Tony Thompson was there, and he brought then the former governor of South Carolina, Jim Edwards, and also the former Secretary of Energy, Jim Edwards, and his wife, and they joined us. Mr. Edwards, he asked me what my presentation was on, and I told him. And one of the things that we talked about is that when you live in this country, you can influence legislation, you can influence policies, and that's really what we get as being a member of such a strong democracy that we have. He got up out of his chair, and he came and shook my hand and put his hands on my shoulder, and he said, "Son, that's what leadership is all about." And what he meant by that, that's what leadership was all about. What he meant is that an organization such as the Health Physics Society can pull together a group of experts. We didn't make that legislation happen. We helped support it. We helped influence it. I think we made some significant changes to it. But those changes also help embark on a major initiative as part of the Code of Conduct. It required additional orders from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to regulate sources of radioactive materials that could be used to make a dirty bomb in. So anyway, I think that was just a tremendous tribute that we had received that day in recognition for the work that the Health Physics Society and the Organization of Agreement State had accomplished.
Attention all personnel, attention all personnel. Diesel generator 200, largest single load rejection test is about to occur. The diesel generator 200 largest single load rejection test is about to occur. The largest single load rejection test will start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
So Savannah River remediation, we are honored and very grateful to each of our speakers who have made the annual summer internship lecture series a tremendous success. And so what I have put together here are the presentations from last year. The first one is from Dr. John Till. As I mentioned before, we had Larry Camper. He had presented an overview on the low-level waste program at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We also had Margaret Severus. She put together an excellent presentation that lays out the requirements for 10 CFR Part 37. And these are the requirements that came in after that legislation I just described to you took place. And it describes all the programs that are in place to track sealed sources, to require import-export, the security requirements that go around it, and the need to ensure that the people that are authorized to handle them are deemed trustworthy and reliable. And then we also had Cindy Jones. She was a nuclear safety attaché for the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so she put together just an excellent presentation last year. And then lastly, we had one of the most renowned radioepidemiologists, Dr. John Boyce, give a presentation. And we put these all on YouTube. We put it on a YouTube channel that we created, and those are available for you guys now to see if you like to. But I encourage you also to share those with your professors and your colleagues. And then on the right-hand side, we also have the presentations this year, which is John Till's 50 Years of Radiological Risk Assessments, Jonathan Sertain's presentation on space nuclear propulsion, Bill Dornside's presentation on the TMI accident, and Barbara Hammert's presentation on lessons learned from the Fukushima accident. So thank you all for participating in the lecture series, and I'll answer any questions that you might have. Anyone from the audience? Jonathan.
How did it feel when you got word that your efforts towards the energy policy act were successful?
How did I feel when I heard that we were successful? You know, I tell you, up until the day before, when I was informed that it was coming out of the conference, I had a lot of reservations as to whether or not it was going to succeed. But a lot of times what you find out is that if you don't succeed today, you keep trying, and maybe you'll be successful the next year. And that's what you saw from 2002 until 2005. There was legislation that kept coming back to Congress. So I doubted. I had some reservations as to whether or not it would occur, but I think I was really proud of the effort that we had put forth, especially being a health physicist and working with the organizations of agreement states, because we had a common vision. It didn't really resonate with me until, here's the kicker. So the next day, I gave my presentation, and Larry Camper was the one who expressed some skepticism as to whether or not this legislation would pass. And I remember the last bullet was that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would be required to embark on a major piece of rulemaking, and they had 18 months to complete it. And that is a major undertaking. Rulemaking sometimes take years and years to complete. But because this issue was as important as it was, there were time limitations put on it. And I was just truly honored. Any other questions?
Online questions, if you would type it up in the chat, I can read it to Scott. Scott, I apologize, I do not remember the person's name, but you were encouraged to reach out to them to ask for their guidance, to get you involved in the society. I hope I'm remembering that correctly.
No, that's excellent, because David Conley manages for the Health Physics Society, I think it's called Capitol Hill Associates. The gentleman had reached out to David and to Keith Dinger. And when I was putting this presentation together, I mean, I was able to construct the vast majority of it, but I could not find the gentleman's name. But I know he was a fellow. He was come from the State Department. He was on loan to Senator Clinton's staff, but he had been really instrumental in putting forth the IAEA Code of Conduct and getting it through the IAEA at the time. But I don't remember his name. And I have no record of it, but I did reach out to David, a month ago when I was putting this together, and he could not find a record of that either. But I knew somebody was going to ask that question.
I've got one from the chat, but you'll have to read it back. After surrounding yourself with great mentors as a young professional, could you say that you're proud of where you are today, or do you think there are things you should have done to be more successful?
All right, let me see if I got that right. Of all the people that I have surrounded myself with for years, are there things that I wish I would have done differently to be more successful? You know, I've had just a great, rewarding career, I can tell you. I go back to the whole issue about making your work to be for a good cause and make it a just cause. And I think about what Neil Newman told me. And most of the projects I've worked on have been along those same lines. It was licensing every aircraft carrier and submarine in the U.S. fleet. It was a major nuclear nonproliferation effort. One of the things that happened with the Energy Policy Act is that, and the whole issue about disused sealed sources was, at the time, Barnwell was going to close its doors to non-regional generators. And for that reason, I had reached out to waste control specialists, and I took over as Vice President of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. And we licensed that facilities. And then we helped pass legislation, or encourage legislation to be passed in Texas, so they would allow the import and export of materials for disposal into that facility. And what that meant is that disused sealed sources, it didn't matter where they were generated from, they could be disposed of. And once they were disposed of, then they were considered to be safe. And then lastly, when I had the opportunity to come here, Phil talks about this all the time. I mean, we get to eliminate one of the single greatest environmental hazards in the state of South Carolina. And I take a lot of pride in being able to work on activities like that I think are good and just like Neil Newman had encouraged me to do. So I can't think of anything I would do different, but ask me in 10 more years.
All right, we've got another one from Heather Lee Dukes, and then one from Frank. Heather Lee Dukes asked, what is the most critical waste legislation that you would like to see come to fruition or be changed?
I tell you, this changes to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Right now, Yucca Mountain is a repository that will probably go nowhere. And the nation, I don't think we have a plan on what we're going to do for the high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel that the U.S. has generated over the past several decades. Under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, Yucca Mountain has to be licensed first before the Department of Energy can take title of it. One of the initiatives that I'd worked on was preparing and filing a license application for storage of spent nuclear fuel. And one of the changes that we knew had to happen is that legislation had to change such that DOE could take title of the fuel before Yucca Mountain would open, because Yucca Mountain will never open. And unless that changes, DOE can't take title of the fuel. And a lot of these independent spent fuel storage facilities or consolidated storage facilities won't be able to take that fuel. And if they were able to do so, what that means is that the shutdown decommissioned reactors across the country, they would, if that law changed, would be able to ship their fuel to either to Texas or perhaps even New Mexico for consolidated interim storage. And what that means is that then the communities that had hosted those facilities, they will be able to repurpose that land for further economic development. And that's what they signed up for. They didn't sign up to store spent fuel for eternity at their sites. They had agreed that reactors could be sited and they could be licensed to provide electricity. So that's the single piece of legislation I would change, and I know that's a long answer. So my apologies, Heather Lee.
All right, next from Frank England. Larry Camper defines the relationships with the states as not a delegation. Compare the relationship of a delegation of EPA to the states compared with NRC relationship with agreement states.
That's a good question, Frank. Under Section 274 of the Atomic Energy Act, what that means is that when the governor of that state and the chairman of the NRC have agreed and signed in writing that state is an agreement state, what that means is that the NRC discontinues its regulatory authority. And what it means is they don't have the authority to regulate those materials that are subject to those portions of the regulations that the agreement state has control over. And that's different from primacy. Like the Environmental Protection Agency, they can delegate some of their responsibilities back to the states, but they still have some control over how those materials are regulated on a state level. And so I think that's the primary distinction is it's the words discontinues its regulatory authority. So when an agreement state is an agreement state, they regulate that program. They're inspected by the NRC to make sure they have compatible programs and that they're administering their programs like they had agreed to as part of the MPAP program is what it's called. And so the NRC can put states on sort of probation if they feel or if they rule that they aren't implementing the regulations that it's set forth in the agreement. So Frank, I hope that answered your question. Did you reply back?
Yes, great answer.
Any other questions?
That's all I see in the chat so far.
Okay, with that, I hope you guys really enjoyed the internship program. And what I would like to say about all of our speakers, they were all volunteers. They put in a tremendous amount of work to try to help this be a successful internship lecture series. And again, we're going to put this on a YouTube channel so we can share it with you. And it's also being hopefully shared with others across the DOE complex. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks.